Our first speaker today is Professor James O'Shea, Head of School of Philosophy at University College Dublin. Professor O'Shea is also the reviews editor of the International Journal of Philosophical Studies and the treasurer of the International Irish Philosophical Club. Alongside his continuing work on systematic issues in philosophies of the philosophers Hume and Kant, he is also working on issues in contemporary analytical philosophy. Professor O'Shea believes that philosophy is a unique discipline in that it envisions how things might coherently link across the sciences, metaphysics, questions of value and experience. I would now like to hand you over to Professor O'Shea.
I was delighted when Owen asked me just recently if I'd contribute to this, and Robert Boyle was on my list of things to learn just in virtue of I'm hoping to do more early modern Irish philosophy than I had previously done. We're thinking of doing a summer school with Boston College and so on, so I was delighted. But I haven't, I used Boyle's gas law a lot in my philosophy of science lectures, but never actually knew anything about the man himself. And I still don't, although I did read some for this, and I will be learning more because although he carefully restricted his inquiries to empirical science, it's just fascinating to see how he thought of the world as a whole and integrated his corpuscularian atomism within that. So I've been at UCD now 34 years. I still have my Boston accent. It doesn't seem to go away. And I'm delighted that Owen asked me to give this talk. So that introduction by Owen sets up things perfectly for me. So I just have one slide on Boyle that builds on what Owen mentioned, his conception of corpuscles that are too small to observe. We think of the world in terms of atoms and what make up atoms, subatomic particles that we can observe in various ways. And Boyle's work on gases and other things convinced him that materials were made up of, that the old view from Aristotle of earth, water, air, and fire as four pure elements, that can't be right. There's something deep down that makes up the differences between these materials and explains how they act in various ways. So he called them corpuscles, and the corpuscular view is linked with atomism. The ancient Greeks had postulated that there are things too small to see and that all changes are changes among these atoms. The Epicureans had this view. And Boyle, the modern period is different because it posits atoms or corpuscles as too small to observe, but making up matter to explain specific experimental results, particularly in Boyle's case, from what I've learned. So this is from Boyle. It's not from The Skeptical Chemist. I was reading about, learning about Boyle from Peter Anstey's article on Boyle against thinking matter. And that's from a work in 1663. And the possibility or not of thinking matter was a huge issue given the rise of science, given the new picture of nature as like a great machine made up of these interacting atoms. What about us? What about thought? What about our immortal souls is a main concern during this period. And so Boyle, this is Boyle from this article, 1663. There are, quote, some phenomena in nature which the ancient Greek atomists cannot satisfactorily explain by any figuration, the shape of the thing's motion, or causal connection. of material particles whatsoever. There are some things the ancient atomists can't explain with their atomism. For some faculties, Boyle says, and operations of the reasonable soul, the reasoning mind, in man, human beings, are of so peculiar and transcendent a kind that as I have not yet found them solidly explicated by corporeal or material matter principles, so I expect not to see them in haste made out by such. That is, the ancient Greeks had no plausible explanation of mind in terms of the atoms that they posited. And the faculty of reason and thinking, Boyle is saying, he's never seen a particular good, even sketch of how matter with its atoms in motion could explain reasoning and thinking. But he's cautious, as Owen, and I've learned about Boyle even in the last weeks reading about him. He's always very cautious, both in his scientific theories and in any further speculations. And so he doesn't deny that it's possible here. He says, I expect not to see those faculties explained in material terms, such as I'm proposing about nature for science. I don't expect to see any explanation of mind anytime soon. But he leaves it open in that way, it seems to me. So, this old saw, if a tree falls alone in the forest, does it make a sound? And this reflects a kind of yes and no answer that early modern science developed over time. Galileo, Robert Boyle, and then the philosopher John Locke, and many other early modern natural philosophers. So that's what they called both philosophers talking about nature and the beginning of modern scientific thinking as well, natural philosophers. So the yes and no answer is roughly the tree disturbs the air when it falls. We would think of it in terms of sound waves and the like. And that's out there in the natural world, there's no doubt about it. So if a tree falls alone in the forest, does it make a sound? Sure, it creates sound waves. But if one means, according to these thinkers, and these can be challenged, these arguments, if one means sound as you hear it or color as you see it through the light waves affecting you, then Galileo says no. If you take away all the animals, there are no colors and sounds in the world as we hear them, as we think of them. And again, there's a lot of complex arguments here. Even at the time, there would be people who disagreed with this, including the great Irish philosopher George Berkeley, Bishop Berkeley, who would argue, no, you don't distinguish colors and sounds as heard from what's out there. What's out there is the sounding, colored, material object. And that led to Berkeley's view that I'll just mention later on. Okay. So here's Galileo saying the same thing. This is from his work, The Assayer, in 1623. Whenever I conceive of any material substance, I'm necessarily constrained to conceive that substance as possessing this or that shape, or in motion, or at rest. These are going to be called the primary qualities of bodies in this period. And Descartes holds the same, and Locke holds the same, that the essence of a body, any material thing, is that it has size, shape, and motion, and solidity, and so on. Galileo continues, but I do not at all feel myself compelled to conceive of bodies as necessarily being red or white, as having color. That's not part of what's essential to a material body for Galileo. As tasting bitter or sweet, as having sound or fragrance. I think, therefore, that these tastes, odors, colors, etc., so far as their objective existence is concerned, are nothing but mere names or words for something which resides exclusively in our sensitive body. It's a result of our sense organs and our brains and so on. And Galileo continues, So that if the perceiving creatures were removed, take away all the animals, all of these qualities, colors, sounds, would be annihilated and abolished from existence. But you'd still have the disturbances in nature, in the matter, that if there were animals would cause them to hear sounds, see colors as we do, but all you'd have is the disturbances in matter. But just because we have given special names to these qualities, like red or C-sharp sound, a thud, different from the names we've given to the primary and real properties. So here comes primary qualities, the shape, sound, motion, what physics needs to explain things when Galileo's dropping the cannonball, if he or describes someone doing this. It's just space, time, motion, matter, measure it, size, shape, and so on. Not colors, sounds, tastes. These aren't amenable to physics. So we call things red for good reason. There's something about them that produces the light waves that would be experienced as color, as long as you're not colorblind and if you're the right kind of animal. We distinguish that from what's going on the surface out there of the object, which doesn't involve color in that sense, according to Galileo. And those are the primary and real properties. But we're built to see things as colored. Descartes holds the same. Locke holds the same. God made us, or evolution made us, to see objects as having colors on their surface. And that's held by all these thinkers, of course. Of course, we give names to things that cause us to have those sensations, but the colors and sounds are really a result of our sense organs in our consciousness. Take away the animals, you'd annihilate the sounds. I have the thing on the right. I have a bigger slide for that. Today, people often distinguish two different problems about mind and matter. One of them has to do with reasoning and thinking and meanings. That's often called the problem of intentionality. How do material brains get to be in states that are about things in the world? And how can we think about Santa Claus, there's no one young here, when Santa Claus doesn't exist? So what's the relationship of a mind to an object that doesn't exist? It's not a relation in any ordinary scientific sense. So how does the brain come to, if the mind is the brain, as Owen hinted is a common view today, we'll see it later, the software of the brain's hardware, one way of thinking of it, Owen mentioned. How do brains get to be in states that are about things that are in the world and things that don't exist? So that's the problem of intentionality. And reasoning, logical reasoning, how is that a matter of material processes? The other one, and that's the one Boyle mentioned, our capacities for thought and reasoning, and he says, I just don't see a plausible explanation in terms of even my own corpuscular theory of how that's going to go, or will ever go anytime soon. Galileo is talking about qualitative consciousness, the colors and sounds, the sensible qualities. What about the sensible qualities out there in a world completely composed of colorless corpuscles or atoms that make up everything? Well, the answer was the corpuscles and matter on the surfaces of things and as they move around are different in different bodies. So a red shirt causes one kind of effect in your senses and you have a sensation of redness. But the redness is in your mind. A green shirt, sure, it's different. It causes a different disturbance. It causes a different sensation. But the greenness is in your mind. Now, as I say, it's still common among particularly scientific thinkers who think in psychology. It's still a common view that there's something going on in the brain that is the home of the sensible qualities. But there are just as strong and probably more thinkers today who think this kind of reasoning can be resisted. And that might come up again later. So today people talk about, can we naturalize intentionality? Naturalize means explain consistent with the scientific picture of the world. That's the problem of thought and reasoning and meaning. How does the brain do it? And the other one is the problem of qualitative consciousness. And Thomas Nagel had a famous article about what's it like to be a bat. And he says, well, that kind of subjective consciousness of an animal that experiences the world through sonar, through sound waves, bouncing. That's a matter of subjective qualitative experience. And other philosophers hold that our consciousness of colors and other qualities, it's a non-physical property. They might not believe in souls or the afterlife. They might be highly scientific. If you read David Chalmers' recent book called Reality Plus, with the plus sign, he argues, look, he's all in favor of cognitive science, but he argues that and so did Thomas Nagel, there are properties of consciousness that aren't physical properties, and that's just true, he argues, about the world. So he doesn't think consciousness can be fully naturalized in the way that some other thinkers do. So we have two different problems. Maybe they're not two different problems, some philosophers would argue, but that's where we are. So I think I've done enough about this. The primary qualities are the ones out there on this view. The secondary qualities are those same objects having a surface or some feature that causes us to experience qualitative consciousness, whatever that is. Well, it was that question, what is it? What's going on with color in the mind, brain, with sound as experienced, that contributed to, basically, they stashed these qualities into the mind or soul. There was no good explanation of them, but at the time, the belief that we have non-physical souls that interact with our brains, as we'll see quite a bit now, I'll talk about that. Qualitative consciousness and intentionality, rationality, are both put in this storehouse of the mind or soul. We can equate them for this purpose. So the sensory qualities are complicated because thinkers like Descartes and Galileo, they had a view that a lot goes on in the brain as they conceived things happening in the brain that has to do with mental images and our sensory perceptions. But ultimately, the qualities as experienced had a non-physical basis in the soul as well. It's a complicated issue, the sensory qualities. But basically it was, there's a cat out there, light rays. This is from a contemporary textbook. Then you have the optic nerve carrying that information, the neural representation of a cat, and the neural correlates of consciousness caused. And what are these arrows, and what is the cloud? Well, that's the percept or idea or perception or consciousness of the cat. And it's in cloud and dots, a dotted line, because that's not physical. But then, of course, if you think it can be naturalized scientifically, you think it is somehow a feature of what's going on in the brain. So that sets this problem of qualitative consciousness. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, you could put it up there for reasons to be explained, because most of us all believe in the soul at that time. And here's one who not only believed in the soul, but thought that we should be able to provide arguments for God's existence, our immortal, non-physical, immaterial souls, not just as matters of belief, but we should be able to prove them. And Descartes was smart, He discovered algebraic geometry, the Cartesian coordinates, x and y axes. That Cartesian is referring to Descartes. So a lot of these thinkers did everything, which in a way is the aspiration of philosophy, to try to see how everything hangs together, but it's very difficult to be a mathematical physicist, a mathematician, and a philosopher today, so we specialize, but I think specialization is a harmful thing in philosophy. We have to do it, and we have to do it to get tenure, and there's just too much. But philosophy is about seeing how it all hangs together, in my view. So Descartes, he was smart. And Galileo had been condemned. Galileo had defended the new sun-centered solar system with the Earth moving, which was thought the church astronomers in Rome and then on biblical grounds, supposedly this was objected to. The Earth doesn't move, but Galileo, when he was condemned, going out the door of his trial, said, but it does move, and so on. And that's the heliocentric view. Descartes agrees with that view and developed a cosmology that embraced it, but he was quiet about it. He had seen what happened to Galileo. But he wrote his famous meditations on first philosophy, and he says in the dedication, I've always been of the opinion that the questions concerning God and the soul were the chief of those that ought to be determined by the help of philosophy, rational philosophy, rather than of theology. For although to us the faithful it be sufficient to hold as matters of faith that the human soul does not perish with the body and that God exists, it yet assuredly seems impossible ever to persuade infidels, literally non-believers, of the reality of any religion or almost even any moral virtue, unless first of all those two things, God and the immortal soul, be proved to them by natural reason. So his method, Descartes, was to doubt everything. And, when you think of it, nothing could seem more certain through the senses than that this earth isn't spinning rapidly and flying. Why isn't there a wind in one constant direction? They asked this of Galileo. He said, I don't know why there's not a wind in one constant direction if the earth is moving around the sun and spinning, but it is. Because of all these other problems, it can simplify, and because of what I'm observing through the telescope and so on. But everything had been shaken up, and so Descartes tries to start from square one by doubting all his beliefs about the world. So Descartes, by the way, like Boyle and Galileo, believes that nature is one great machine subject to mathematical laws and so on. So he is one of the great contributors to the new mechanical philosophy, the new mechanistic picture of nature amenable to physics. And he wanted to show how that can go along with rational belief in God and the immortal soul. So he did it this way. If anything is even the slightest doubtful, if you can tell a science fiction story where everything's a virtual reality and none of you exist and so on, well, let's entertain that doubt. Let's treat anything that's even conceivably doubtable as if it were false, just for the purpose of our inquiry. And this will be where he comes up with, I think, therefore I am. It's not that he really ever doubted that. It's to look for the one indubitable foundation. So he offers a variety of arguments in his classic first meditation, of 6. He argues that, look, dreams can be fuzzy and all this, but the content of any waking experience like here can conceivably could have been the content of a dream. And so how do we rule out, and David Chalmers' book is fun if you're into this stuff, Reality Plus, again, because he likes this kind of argument. He thinks Descartes was right, and Chalmers uses simulations and virtual reality headsets and so on to argue, how do you know you're not in a simulated world? And he argues you don't, basically. But he does believe there is a world, and so that's what his book is about. So, and Bertrand Russell, too, a great philosopher, the early 20th century, late 19th century mathematician, logician, he agreed with Descartes. He said it's logically possible that we're all dreaming, or that the universe was created yesterday with memories as if it existed, but your conscious waking experience now is conceivably, you can tell a story without internal logical contradiction, that it's a simulation, or you're dreaming the whole thing, and so on. The Matrix is and actually Chalmers, there's a book, a collection of articles on the Matrix, and Chalmers has an article in there as well. How do you know you're not in the Matrix? So you're really lying in a vat filled with goop, and scientists are giving you a simulated world. How do you know you're not? It's not easy. You got to take a convenient pill. I haven't seen the movie in a long. So at any given time, it's logically possible I might be dreaming and there's no world of bodies or matter. These two, philosophy is all about arguments that are challengeable. They're about questions that don't have scientific, replicatable answers. They're more about who's got the best arguments in favor or against whatever the debate is. So I'll go quickly through some of this, but here's another example, that Hilary Putnam, he talked about being a brain in a vat, and scientists are feeding you experiences in your brain as if you're walking outside in the sun, but that's really your unfortunate situation, and so on. Putnam himself argued that these scenarios are not really coherent, that to entertain a thought with meaning, it already has to involve relations to the world, an external world, or you don't really mean the things that you think you do. And that's a very complex, interesting matter in contemporary philosophy. Okay, anyway, he argues, the thing I can know for absolute certainty is that even if someone is deceiving me in all these experiences, I'm having them. I exist as a conscious subjectivity. I think, therefore I am, or I am conscious, therefore I exist. It's a starting point of this might be a mistake as well. This is what philosophy is all about. Where do you start? Was it a good idea to start here? Descartes thinks the real starting point is internal subjectivity from your own conscious perspective. The world might or might not exist. Many other philosophers, and I think Immanuel Kant, who's the guy I work on a lot in the 18th century, he had a fancy argument to say, no, that scenario is not coherent. You couldn't be aware of your own past mental life unless you were already directly aware of a material world, not things in themselves. If anyone knows Kant, I'm talking about the world in space and time. And Ludwig Wittgenstein, who lived for a while in Ireland, famous 20th century philosopher, he had a kind of argument, too, that our awareness of our own conscious states requires already being in a world of other people and so on, even to have those kinds of experiences. So like everything in philosophy, these are debatable, but a lot of, there are philosophers who would agree with Descartes' move. Everything has to begin at its foundation with inner consciousness. And then he argued outward. My idea of God I have the idea of God, even if nothing else exists, of a being than which none greater can be conceived. And he tries to argue that where did that idea come from of something with all perfections or attributes? Well, it has to be the idea of a being that exists, because it's better to exist than not exist. If it's an all-perfect being, that being exists. And so he argued that my idea of God has to have been caused by a really infinite, perfect being. And of course, a lot of philosophers objected to that argument. Even the tradition from Thomas Aquinas, the so-called ontological argument, is always, it's one that logicians really like, that just from the concept of a greatest being with all perfections, that being must exist. But then a lot of philosophers and theologians think, no, that argument doesn't work. But the way Descartes did it was just from his idea he can prove God must have caused that idea. And that's the idea of a perfect being who wouldn't deceive me. So my knowledge of the world is grounded thanks to the benevolence of God. Idea of a perfect being must exist, and since that being's perfect, wouldn't deceive me systematically. Another philosopher, David Hume, is one of my favorites, 18th century Scottish-British philosopher, and he commented on Descartes, to have recourse to the veracity of the Supreme Being in order to prove the veracity of our senses is surely making a very unexpected circuit. And I like that quote, just that there's a table here, I have to prove God exists first and God's benevolence, God wouldn't deceive me. And Hume says, no, not to mention that if the external world be called into question, which Hume does when in his skeptical arguments, we shall be at a loss to find any arguments by which we can prove the existence of God or of any of his attributes. So the solution to these problems had to be, there were philosophers that were more naturalist philosophers of the time, and Hume was one of them, and he said, I'm not buying that argument. But here's Descartes. He uses what we've been talking about, that the first thing we can know is our own inner consciousness. The world of matter and space conceivably mightn't exist, but in the end, of course, he believes it exists, both in ordinary life and philosophy. Descartes believes we have knowledge of the material world. But at the end of the Meditations, he says, look, although possibly, or rather certainly, as I shall say in a moment when he proves that God warrants our knowledge, I possess a body with which I'm very intimately conjoined, his soul and his material body. Yet because on the one side I have a clear and distinct idea of myself, my thinking self, insofar as I'm only a thinking and unextended, a being with no shape or matter, a pure thinking thing. And on the other hand, I possess a distinct idea of material bodies, inasmuch as it's only extended in space. So there's my thinking self, which has nothing to do with matter and space. And then there's matter and space. Those are two very different things. It is certain that I, my soul or mind, is entirely and absolutely distinct from my body and brain and can exist without it. So that's Descartes' famous argument for the real distinction between a non-physical soul, which is myself, my mind, and the whole material world that he's doing a beautiful job of laying out the new mechanical, mathematizable nature, but he draws the line at us. Our minds are not physical for Descartes. Other animals, by the way, he says, are just fancy machines. They're delicate biological. There were the puppets in Paris at the time, if I recall. It's been a long time since I read about that, but there were impressive ways you could use mechanics and machinery to make things look like they're designed, and though they were designed, those puppets. But the Cartesians held other animals are just fancy machines. But we, with our rational thinking souls, are non-physical beings. So here's an argument. I'll just put it up quick. There's a kind of argument in what Descartes' doing, and I just did this and I'm not trying to be rigorous here, but as we've seen, it's allegedly possible, without any internal contradiction, that the world of matter does not exist, that it's a simulation, or I'm being deceived, or I'm dreaming. But it's not possible, Descartes argues, that right now I don't exist as a thinking thing. So it's possible the material world, including my brain, doesn't exist. It's at least conceivable. But it's not possible that I, as a consciousness, don't exist. So, conclusion from 1 and 2, it's possible that I exist and my body and brain do not. It's conceivable my mind could exist, say, in an afterlife, without bodily resurrection. That's what he's arguing for, basically. Since it's possible to have one without the other, mind without matter, they must be different. So goes the argument. So I really am a distinct thing from my body and brain and the whole material world. So this was the kind of reasoning Descartes used, but once again, these can be challenged, these arguments. So there we have dualism. Your mind, your soul, your rational capacities for thought, non-physical. No shape, no size, no weight. It's the soul that will live in the afterlife, all the way back to Plato, who also had before you were born, and so on. And a person is a mind or soul plus a body and brain, like a pilot steers a ship, said Plato. So that's the distinction. That's dualism, and that's huge during this period. And Boyle is a Cartesian dualist as far as I've learned in reading about him. Leibniz gives a nice, Leibniz, another smart philosopher, invented or discovered the calculus at roughly the same time Newton did, Isaac Newton, and there were great debates between the Germans and the English, just like football. Who got calculus first? It was a huge debate. Was it the German Leibniz or was it Newton? And they both did in their ways. So Mill had this nice analogy. We must confess, that is, he holds, that perception, mental activity, and what depends on it is inexplicable in terms of mechanical reasons, in terms of the new mechanical philosophy. Just like Boyle, we saw earlier, holds this. That is, through shapes and motions of matter. If we imagine that there's a machine, and this in 1711 is kind of a cool thing to have come up with, whose structure makes it think, sense, and have perceptions, both intentionality and qualitative consciousness. We could conceive it enlarged, keeping the same proportions, so that we could enter into it as one enters a mill. If you had a thinking, say an android, or if you had a thinking machine, and you could enter into its brain, let's say, if it were the size of a mill, that's his thought experiment. Assuming that when inspecting its interior, we find only parts that push one another, the new mechanical physics, we will never find anything to explain a perception. So he's not cautious like Boyle was. Boyle's saying, not any time that I can see soon. I'm in no haste to make those speculations. Leibniz says, no way. And we will never find anything to explain a perception or thought in such a machine. And you can think in terms of brain functioning. And so we should seek perception in the simple substance. Simple means no parts. Everything that has parts can break down into those parts. Matter has parts. When philosophers use the term simple, simplicity, they mean something that has no parts. And the main thing that has no parts is the soul. The soul is a perfectly simple, non-physical. That's why it can survive the breakdown of your body into parts on this view. So, I have to thank Gemini for giving me a quick. I'm not very good at these things, but it's handy to ask Gemini to give me a little picture of what this is. There, you're walking in the machine that can allegedly think, according to Leibniz, and it's blown up the size of a room, and I don't see anything that can produce thoughts in there. But dualism has its own problems. By the way, I think I had a slide on this, but I perhaps don't. Those of you that know anything about John Searle's Chinese room thought experiment, you could argue it relies on some of these same intuitive responses. Okay, so there is a big problem for dualism. If there's a non-physical soul, let's say I decide to move my hand to the right, well, that was a command from my non-physical rational soul, and Descartes argues it interacts with my brain somehow in the pineal gland of the brain, he speculated, and then the nerves. Descartes had a theory of the nerves as like a kind of pulley system, and then I move my arm. Or if I pinch myself, I again get something moving up, disturbing my brain, and then it affects the soul, and I feel conscious pain in my soul or mind. So you've got a non-physical thing with no size, shape, or weight causing me to move my arm, physical thing, through the brain, and you can have the reverse direction. I pinch myself, I feel that in my soul. But that's not the way scientists of the period even were thinking about nature. Physical happenings have physical causes. Moving my arm, if it's got a cause literally out of nowhere, that's going to be a problem. And it's very difficult to see how a non-physical thing, non-spatial, non-material, can have physical effects. If Cartesian dualism were true, then some effects would be the effects of non-physical events. Or you could just say maybe the mind has no effects on anything. It's just produced by the brain, but that wouldn't be a very satisfactory view, because then you couldn't explain how your thought caused you. You vote for one candidate, not the other. If your thoughts have no causes in the material world, how does that work? Okay, so a kind of stock thing, but again, like everything else on these metaphysical questions, metaphysical just meaning not answerable by physics, perhaps, in this sense. Is that a good argument? Is nature really closed in that sense? Well, that's another thing that could be challenged. Okay, Princess Elizabeth raised this to Descartes, actually, and she, from Bohemia, she wrote to him, and roughly the gist of it was, how can a non-physical reality, the soul with no weight or motion, interact causally with our physical brain and body? Could you please explain that to me? Or even why doesn't it have these counterintuitive consequences? And that continued to be a major issue for soul-body dualism, soul-brain dualism. But it's still compelling, and it still has some of its defenders. Not near, most, they do actual polls of these things. Chalmers is actually one who does these polls. Very few philosophers, but there are some, defend soul-brain dualism of that substantial kind. Soul and God have become more matters of faith, although for the Catholic Church, God is demonstrable by reason and so on. But a lot of philosophers I mentioned, including the Chalmers book itself, defend non-physical aspects to the mind-brain. But the soul-body dualism, because of this problem, I think fell out of favor. But we're talking about the 1600s and 1700s, and there's a philosopher, Roderick Chisholm, in the 60s. He did a little in the pre-tech age, he had his drawings for his students. There are 4 more of these on the next slide. And this is kind of naturalism, where to explain thought, there's the creature with its brain, us, and we're in a natural environment, and we can explain mind in those terms, but the common view wasn't that. And we'll see Thomas Hobbes. I know I have to finish soon, and I'll just get to Hobbes in a second, and we'll finish up. But this was the common view. Descartes' dualism, interactionist dualism. Robert Boyle, I don't know exactly what his thoughts were on the nature of the interaction or whether he got into that problem, but he's a Cartesian dualist. You could say the brain, the material world, just gives off consciousness as a kind of effect, and consciousness is non-physical but doesn't cause anything, but that's not thought to be, by most people, a satisfactory answer, because if your mind is just epiphenomenal and doesn't cause anything, that's not great. Berkeley's idealism, Berkeley said we do live in a world of colored-sounding bodies out there. The explanation for that is that everything is a mind or perceptions in a mind, including God's mind. So we in this room are a community of souls, and God is causing us to have perceptions as of a stable material world. But for Berkeley, everything is either a mind or a perception. And Leibniz, he held God made it so that it's like 2 clocks running perfectly. So if I throw a ball up, all of our conscious minds would experience the perception of a ball rising and falling, and God made it so that the material world correlates with that, but there's no causal interaction between the two. The matter and mind are like 2 God-created clocks that run together. Malebranche said, well, God kind of does it by, if someone's coming to hit you in the head, God causes your soul to kick into a state of pain. And so God is constantly causing mental events on the occasion of material events. But, Hobbes comes around and says, wow, why don't we try the little one that was just the material person in the natural world? Can we do it that way? And Hobbes said, I haven't seen knockdown arguments that we can't do it through nature and matter conceivably. And Hobbes said, look, reasoning could have to do with language and how we learn words and how we combine them. Why isn't it that a brain could do that if it were built in a certain way, so that we learn words, we associate them with objects, and maybe we combine them in the natural material brain? And there's Hobbes basically laying this out. Reasoning depends on terms or names, which depends on images of things which are quasi-physical. All of that depends on motions and our bodily organs. So the mind will be nothing more than motion occurring in various parts of the organic. So you had the heroic naturalist view here to say we could do it. We could explain mind without the dotted immaterial postulations. But Descartes replied to Hobbes. These were objections Hobbes put to Descartes, as did others like Princess Elizabeth. And Descartes said, look, words are not concepts or thoughts. Concepts are universal. Our capacity for language cannot be explained in terms of just associations among images and words. And actually, he's probably right about that, Descartes. So somehow to explain thinking, he says, look, whether a Frenchman and a German are able to reason, for who doubts? No one doubts that a Frenchman and a German are able to reason exactly the same way about the same things, though they yet conceive the words in an entirely diverse way. And that relates to Hugh's thing on the software. the mind not being the hardware per se, it might have to do with the programming or the relations between things realized in the brain, so that the French word rouge and the German word rot, they play the same functional role in the language of those two people. Everything could be material, but it's not it being material that makes it the concept of red. Rouge, sure, it's different from rot in German. They're both concepts of red because of how those words function in the behavioral economy of German speakers and French speakers, both responding to red objects, both inferring that red is a color. Functionally, function is what makes conceptual thinking, not what they're made of. And Hume put that in terms of the mind being the software running on the hardware of the brain. I mean, Owen, I was saying Hugh, sorry, Owen, I don't know where I got Hugh. And so Descartes' argument might not be conclusive. Sure, lots of different things are going on in the French person thinking of red and the German person thinking of red, but what matters is the wider systematic functioning. And we're just coming to the end. I was going to just give you I only have 2 slides here, but some of those arguments, and I think, by the way, that one of the revolutions that Kevin Mitchell will tell us about later on in the day, biology was crucial, of course, in the 19th century, because you could, and then the 20th century, and continuing to figure out how it works. But there you could get a kind of naturalistic story of how you get adaptively functioning cognitive beings through a story, a long story that is naturalistic, but explains, say, why the frog lashes its tongue when you put an object in front of it and move it in a certain way, because it's built to have that kind of reaction to that kind of situation. It's designed, not by God, or maybe by God as well, but by evolutionary processes. That kind of functioning has to take in a whole wider story. You don't just isolate it in a thought experiment to explain how mind relates to the environment. And another one might be computational, the software analogy, that the insight that it's not what you're made of that makes you a thinking thing, but the relations among and to the external world of whatever you're made of. And I think Smart had he's Australian, he's British-born Australian philosopher, he had some good arguments against Descartes' argument. He said, of course, it can seem to you that it's possible to have mind without a brain, but those aren't really good arguments. It's also possible for you to imagine water being a perfect element with no parts. And you could imagine water being one of the 4 fundamental elements in the universe like the Greeks did. But we've discovered that water is H2O. And so it doesn't mean that water isn't H2O just because you can imagine it, or it's possible that you could imagine water without H2O. And same with your concept of the mind is completely different from your concept of brain processes. They are very different in concept, but we could discover they're the same sort of complex thing conceived in 2 different ways. So the 20th century, I think, did a lot of things to make the anti-naturalist arguments cast into doubt. But I have to say, all the problems are still live in philosophy, and that either drives you crazy or you like philosophy. Yeah. Thanks very much.